In the last demo, when we dragged the genre field into the column labels in our third pivot, our worksheet automatically resized a bunch of columns due to a default setting called autofit. So what happened was that all of these columns all the way out to R got crunched down to the minimum width necessary to display the data in all of those genre columns, which in turn shrunk the width of any charts that happen to be sitting on top of those columns. So the good news is that there are at least two ways to avoid this issue, both of which are a little bit sneaky. So this was something that bugged me for years before I finally figured it out. And lucky for you, I'm feeling pretty generous today, so I suppose I'll share my secrets. Now, solution one is to adjust the chart properties for any of the charts that are getting resized. And this is a default setting in Excel, so when you drop in a new chart, like this column chart for instance, you'll see that it's essentially tied to the height of the underlying rows and the width of the underlying columns. So if columns get stretched or resized, for instance, any chart sitting on top of that column will also be stretched or resized accordingly. And this can get really annoying when you want to create a nice, clean, and organized view, and changes that are made elsewhere in the worksheet keep skewing all of your alignments. So here's the deal. We can just select one of the charts that's getting squeezed, right-click, drill into the Format Chart area, and that will open up the formatting pane here. And this third option here, Size and Properties, allows me to drill into the Properties options to change the way this chart responds to cell sizing, noting that the first option is the default, which says Move and Size with Cells. So in this case, and to be honest, in most cases, you'll likely want to choose either the second or the third option here. Now the second will allow the chart to move around or shift if columns or rows are added or resized, but it won't allow the chart to stretch or distort at all. And the third option basically allows the chart to remain completely disconnected from row or column changes. In this case, either option will work just fine, but let's select the second and show you what it does. So let's close out of the formatting pane. I'd selected the second option here for this column chart. So now when I drag column widths, you can see that this second chart, which we didn't change the properties for, continues to stretch while our first chart no longer does. But if we insert a new column, both will shift entirely. And that's kind of the difference between the second and the third properties options that we talked about. So let's go ahead and select our second two charts. We can edit these together. Right click, Size and Properties will take us right to that pane, since these are options that apply to both of these different chart types. And then right here in Properties, Move but don't size with cells. So there you go, that will fix the problem. Solution number two involves changing the properties of the pivot table itself instead of the chart. So if we select a cell in one of our pivot tables, like this first one for instance, we can go into our pivot table tools, options, simply uncheck this box that says Auto Fit Column Widths on Update here in the Layout and Format tab. And when we uncheck the box, our columns won't resize as we adjust our pivot table view. And as a result, any charts tied to those columns will continue to be preserved as well. So now, for instance, in this first pivot, if we drop something like language into the columns, you can see obviously the chart updated because now it's trying to show the data by language, but the columns themselves didn't change widths. They stayed preserved, which is exactly what we want. So let's drag language back out. Now another setting where this often comes into play is when you have data columns that contain very, very long strings of text. Now under the default pivot table mode, the pivot will constantly adjust to try to fit that long field as long as it's included as part of your view, which gets really annoying if you have to manually shrink it back down or manually change the column width every time you make an adjustment to the pivot. And I'll actually walk you through an example of that in one of the case studies at the end of the course. So there you have it, two pretty elegant solutions to prevent charts from resizing with cells.